America ran out of artillery shells, and the M795 is the reason that sentence is not an exaggeration. 155 millimeters in diameter, 41 manufacturing steps from raw steel billet to finished projectile. A production process that takes over a year from raw material to delivered round when the full supply chain lead time is counted. And in February 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine and the United States began transferring ammunition to Ukrainian forces, the entire American production capacity for this specific shell was concentrated in a single facility, the Scranton Army Ammunition Plant in Pennsylvania, producing 14,000 rounds per month. Ukraine was firing 6,000 rounds per day. The United States was producing in 30 days what Ukraine was consuming in 2 days and 8 hours. That is not a supply chain problem. That is a strategic miscalculation accumulated over 3 decades of defense procurement decisions made on the assumption that the next war would look like the Gulf War: short, decisive, technology-dominant, and artillery-light, rather than like the Western Front with precision guidance bolted on. To understand how America arrived at a single production line for its standard artillery shell in 2022, you need to understand what America told itself about war in 1991 and why that story was so compelling for so long. Operation Desert Storm lasted 100 hours of ground combat. 100 hours! The air campaign had run for 38 days beforehand, systematically destroying Iraqi command infrastructure, logistics networks, and ground force concentrations from altitudes that Iraqi air defenses could not reach. By the time the ground forces crossed the line on February 24, 1991, the Iraqi army had been degraded to the point where organized resistance was possible in only a fraction of the sectors the coalition attacked. American and coalition forces liberated Kuwait, destroyed the 4th largest army in the world by count of equipment, and suffered fewer than 200 combat deaths across the entire operation. Artillery supported the advance. It was not the primary instrument of the war. The total number of 155 millimeter artillery rounds fired by American forces during Operation Desert Storm was approximately 60,000. 60,000 shells across the entire conflict. In the Ukraine war beginning in 2022, Ukrainian forces were consuming that same number in 10 days. In the worst periods of attritional fighting in the Donbass, the daily consumption rate reached 6,000 rounds, an entire Desert Storm's artillery expenditure every 10 days. Sustained not for 100 hours, but continuously across months and years. The lesson the American military drew from Desert Storm was seductive in its internal logic. Precision-guided weapons could substitute for volume of fire. A single GPS-guided artillery round placed within a meter of its target did the work of dozens of unguided rounds fired for effect. Air power could suppress enemy artillery before ground forces engaged it. The future of warfare was networked, precise, and fast. A revolution in military affairs, as the defense intellectuals and procurement strategists of the 1990s called it, that would render the mass production industrial warfare of the Second World War as obsolete as the cavalry charge. Large stockpiles of unguided artillery ammunition were a legacy commitment to a model of warfare that was passing from relevance. This was not a fringe view articulated by theorists at the margins of the defense establishment. It was the institutional consensus encoded in official documents. The Office of Net Assessment under Andrew Marshall produced a series of studies through the 1990s that defined the intellectual framework, the argument that sensor-to-shooter networks, stealth aircraft, and precision munitions represented a discontinuous change in the character of warfare that would advantage the technologically sophisticated military over the numerically superior one. The 1997 Quadrennial Defense Review, the foundational strategic planning document of the Clinton era, explicitly oriented American military planning around the ability to fight 2 nearly simultaneous major theater wars using the technological overmatch model, the assumption being that American precision and connectivity would compress the duration of any conflict well below what industrial-era attrition planning had required. The 2001 Quadrennial Defense Review under Donald Rumsfeld pushed the concept further, arguing that transformation, the shift to lighter, faster, more networked forces, was the primary military investment priority, and that legacy capabilities including large ammunition stockpiles were precisely the kind of Cold War thinking that transformation was designed to transcend. Weight was a liability. Stockpiles were a liability. The future was speed, precision, and network. The unguided artillery shell was a relic. Operation Iraqi Freedom in 2023 confirmed the theory, or appeared to. American forces drove to Baghdad in 3 weeks. Total artillery expenditure across the entire conflict was approximately 30,000 rounds. The Iraqi army, larger and better equipped than it had been in 1991, essentially dissolved under the weight of American air power and armored maneuver. The lesson was confirmed. Modern American warfare did not consume artillery shells at the rates that Second World War or Korean War planners had designed for. The production system could be sized accordingly, and the 2 decades of counterinsurgency operations in Afghanistan and Iraq that followed conventional victory did nothing to challenge that conclusion. Counterinsurgency consumed ammunition at rates that peacetime training exercises could replicate without straining the supply chain. What nobody in this intellectual framework had fully accounted for was the difference between fighting an adversary that could not contest American air superiority and fighting one that could. Russia in Ukraine in 2022 was not Iraq in 1991. Russian S-300 and S-400 air defense systems made the airspace over the battlefield genuinely contested in ways that American planners had not experienced since Korea. The precision weapons that had substituted for volume in Desert Storm were expensive, finite, and dependent on supply chains that took months to replenish. The satellite-guided Excalibur artillery round that could substitute for a dozen M795 shells cost approximately $100,000 per round against the M795's $800. Firing Excalibur at the rate Ukrainian forces needed firepower was not economically or logistically viable, regardless of how many were in the inventory. The war reverted, through the iron logic of cost and availability, to the unguided artillery shell that the defense intellectuals of the 1990s had been in the process of rendering obsolete. And the production system for that shell had been sized for a world those intellectuals had convinced themselves was coming. The ammunition production infrastructure that would have allowed a different answer had been built during a different era and was now being systematically reduced. During World War II, the United States had operated 92 ammunition plants, a network of government-owned facilities distributed across the country, capable of surging production on short notice because they existed specifically for that purpose, staffed by workforces that maintained institutional knowledge of the specific manufacturing processes that explosive ordnance production required. By 1964, the number had fallen to 26. By the end of the Cold War, it stood at 16. The logic of each reduction was defensible in isolation. A plant not producing at capacity was consuming money that the defense budget needed elsewhere, and the dominant strategic theory said the surge those plants existed to enable would not be required. The BRAC process, base realignment and closure, formalized the mechanism by which politically painful decisions could be made systematically rather than piecemeal. 5 rounds of BRAC closures between 1988 and 2025 closed over 350 military facilities. The ammunition plants went alongside the bases. The Indiana Army ammunition plant near Charlestown closed in 1988 and became an industrial park. 4,000 acres transferred to the state, another 5,900 to a redevelopment authority. 60 companies and 10,500 workers eventually employed on the former site in activities that had nothing to do with artillery shells. The Alabama Army Ammunition Plant, the Louisiana Army Ammunition Plant, the Volunteer Army Ammunition Plant in Tennessee, facilities that had been producing ordnance since the Second World War, were closed, repurposed, or placed in standby status that was functionally indistinguishable from closure, given the institutional memory and specialized workforce they required to operate. The specific consequence of each individual closure was recorded as a saving. The aggregate consequence of all the closures together was not recorded anywhere in a form that prompted institutional alarm, because the aggregate was an accumulation of individually rational decisions rather than a single decision that anyone had made explicitly. Nobody signed an order reducing American 155 millimeter production capacity to a single plant. What happened was that each plant closed for its own specific reason, and the system that remained after all the closures was the system that remained. The process was, as William Perry himself acknowledged in 2016, not planned. It was a haphazard set of decisions made by business leaders based on market and company financial conditions, without a grand strategy behind it, without a grand strategy in front of it, and without anyone assigned to evaluate what the sum of the individual parts produced. The privatization of the defense industrial base accelerated alongside the plant closures. At a dinner in October 1993 that defense industry analysts came to call the Last Supper, Deputy Defense Secretary William Perry and Les Aspin hosted the senior executives of every major American defense contractor and told them, in straightforward terms, to consolidate, reduce overhead, close facilities, merge with competitors. The government was reducing its defense budget, and the number of prime contractors the shrinking budget could sustain was smaller than the existing number. Perry and Aspin offered no plan for how the consolidation should proceed. They simply announced the direction and expected the market to find the path, which it did, according to its own logic. Over the following 5 years, the number of major prime defense contractors fell from 51 to 5. The output of the commercial defense industrial base decreased by approximately 35% across the 1990s. The ammunition sector followed the same logic but faced a specific additional constraint that made recovery from the consolidation particularly difficult. Artillery shell production is not the kind of manufacturing that private markets naturally sustain at commercial scale. There is no civilian market for high-explosive steel projectiles. The only customer is the government and the government's peacetime demand, sized for training consumption and modest war reserve accumulation, does not justify the capital investment required to maintain large-scale production facilities. The rational response for a private contractor operating in this environment is to invest exactly as much capacity as the government's current contract requires and no more. Building capacity for a surge that the customer has not contracted for and the dominant strategic theory says will not happen is not rational from a commercial perspective. It is expensive, speculative, and unrewarded. And so it was not done. The specific manufacturing challenge of artillery shell production compounds this structural problem in ways that made the 1990s consolidation particularly hard to reverse quickly. Forging and machining high-explosive steel projectiles is not a process that can be set up in a standard industrial facility with a standard industrial workforce. The steel alloys used in M795 production require specific heat treatment processes to achieve the metallurgical properties that allow a shell to survive the forces of propellant ignition, travel down a gun barrel at 2,700 feet per second, and then detonate reliably on impact, rather than prematurely. The forging presses that shape the steel billets into the correct ogive profile, the aerodynamic nose shape that determines the shell's ballistic coefficient and therefore its range and accuracy, are large, expensive, and purpose-built equipment that cannot be sourced quickly. The copper rotating bands that engage the rifling of the gun barrel and impart spin stabilization to the projectile are manufactured to tolerances that require specialized tooling and quality control processes. A plant that allows its heat treatment processes, its forging equipment, and its quality control systems to degrade loses institutional knowledge that cannot be recovered quickly even with unlimited funding. The workers who understand these processes require years of training on processes that have no civilian analog. A machinist who can produce automotive components to tight tolerances cannot automatically produce artillery shell components to ordnance tolerances without substantial retraining on the specific requirements of ordnance manufacturing. By 2022, the active production capacity for 155 millimeter artillery shells in the United States had consolidated to a single operating line at the Scranton Army Ammunition Plant, supplemented by the Iowa Army Ammunition Plant's load, assemble, and pack operations that received the metal projectile parts from Scranton, filled them with explosive, and fitted the fuses. 2 facilities, one producing the steel body, one completing the finished round, the entire American 155 millimeter production chain running through a 15.3-acre plant near downtown Scranton, Pennsylvania, operated by General Dynamics Ordnance and Tactical Systems on behalf of the United States Army. The Scranton plant is not a new facility. It has been producing artillery projectiles since the Second World War. The original construction dates to the 1940s when the United States was building the ammunition infrastructure for the largest industrial war in history. Generations of Scranton workers have worked its production floors, machining and forging steel billets into the shapes that artillery requires. The plant survived the post-war drawdown, the BRAC process, and the consolidation of the 1990s, partly because it was already government-owned, partly because it was already the most efficient surviving facility of its type, and partly because the political economy of closing an operating defense plant in a working-class Pennsylvania city produces a level of congressional resistance that the BRAC process was specifically designed to overcome but did not always manage to do. Scranton kept its plant. The work concentrated in it as its counterparts elsewhere were closed or repurposed. By 2022, it was not one of several redundant sources of supply. It was the source, the single production line. The arithmetic of February 2022 was not difficult to perform. 9,000 rounds per month produced, 6,000 rounds per day consumed by Ukrainian forces in active combat against Russian artillery that was firing in comparable volumes. The United States had transferred howitzers to Ukraine, the M797 lightweight howitzer, the M795 Paladin self-propelled howitzer, systems designed to fire the M795 and its variants. The weapons were there, the trained crews were being developed, the fire support doctrine was being applied. What was missing was the ammunition to sustain the rate of fire that the tactical situation required. The shortage had immediate consequences that extended well beyond the Ukrainian battlefield. The United States had committed to supporting Ukraine's defense against Russian aggression as a matter of stated national policy. The ability to fulfill that commitment depended on the ability to supply ammunition at the rate the war consumed it. When the production rate was 9,000 rounds per month and the consumption rate was 6,000 per day, the gap between commitment and capability was visible to every NATO ally watching the American response. The question being asked in defense ministries across Europe was pointed and specific. Germany's Bundeswehr had revealed artillery stockpiles sufficient for a few days of intensive combat, a figure that German officials confirmed to the Bundestag Defense Committee in late 2022 in testimony that produced considerable parliamentary concern. The German defense industry had been operating its artillery ammunition production at rates calibrated to annual peacetime resupply orders, not to the requirements of sustained high-intensity conflict. Rheinmetall, Germany's principal defense manufacturer, announced significant production expansion plans in 2023, but acknowledged lead times of 2 to 3 years before new capacity would come online. France's munitions reserves were similarly thin. The French Army's artillery ammunition stockpiles had been drawn down through years of counterinsurgency operations in Africa and the Middle East that consumed different categories of ammunition and did not replenish the conventional artillery stocks. Britain's Royal Artillery had drawn down its 155 millimetre stocks through the same post-Cold War optimization logic that had produced the single production line in Scranton. Polish defense officials, whose country shares a border with both Ukraine and the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad, and who had perhaps the most urgent reason to think carefully about artillery ammunition stockpiles, acknowledged that their own reserves were insufficient for extended high-intensity conflict and that their domestic production capacity required emergency expansion. The Ukraine war did not reveal a uniquely American failure of industrial planning. It revealed a systemic NATO assumption built on 30 years of peace dividend thinking and confirmed by 2 decades of counterinsurgency operations that consumed ammunition at rates orders of magnitude lower than peer-on-peer warfare. That industrial production capacity for attritional artillery warfare was a legacy commitment that modern military technology had made unnecessary. Every NATO member had made that assumption in its own way, through its own budget cycles, with its own version of the revolution in military affairs logic. Every NATO member discovered in 2022 that the assumption was wrong. The M795 shortage in Scranton was the most visible manifestation of the problem because the United States was the largest and most capable alliance member, and because the transparency of the American defense procurement system made the specific numbers, 9,000 rounds per month, 6,000 rounds per day, documentable and reportable in ways that European Defense Ministry figures were not always publicly available. But the structural failure was alliance-wide. The single production line in Scranton was America's version of a problem that existed in every NATO capital. The response, when it came, was substantial and expensive. The Army threw money at the problem with a speed that peacetime procurement rarely permits. By May 2023, the Army had awarded more than $243 million for new production equipment at Scranton alone. The overall ammunition production modernization budget was increased by 86% above pre-war plans through Ukraine's supplemental appropriations. New production lines were ordered for the Scranton facility specifically to expand M795 capacity toward 35,000 rounds per month. The Iowa Army ammunition plant's load-assemble pack capacity was expanded. New facilities were commissioned at Camden, Arkansas, where General Dynamics Ordnance and Tactical Systems opened a dedicated load-assemble pack plant in April 2026, designed to produce 50,000 complete rounds per month when fully operational. A second new facility in Kansas was under development for similar purposes. The total spent on 155 millimetre shell production between February 2022 and September 2025 was $4.5 billion. Confirmed by the DoD Inspector General's report published in July 2026. The production ramp produced real results, but slower than the targets required, and the reasons for the gap between ambition and delivery deserve specific examination rather than generic acknowledgement. The first bottleneck was equipment procurement. The forging presses and machining centers required for new production lines at Scranton are specialized industrial equipment with long manufacturing lead times. The companies that build them have their own capacity constraints, and ordering a new forging press in 2022 meant waiting for delivery in 2024 or 2025, regardless of the urgency of the requirement or the size of the check written. The second bottleneck was workforce. The ordnance manufacturing workforce had contracted through the 1990s and 2000s alongside the facilities it staffed. Scranton maintained a core workforce through the consolidation period, but expanding from the workforce required for 9,000 rounds per month to the workforce required for 35,000 rounds per month meant hiring and training hundreds of new workers in processes that required months of instruction and had no civilian analog. The training pipeline itself became a constraint. Qualified trainers were limited, training equipment was limited, and the institutional knowledge required to pass on the specific processes of M795 production resided in an aging workforce that could not be replicated at speed. The third bottleneck was propellant. The M795 shell body is only one component of a complete artillery round. The propellant charges that fire it are manufactured in separate facilities by separate contractors, and the propellant supply chain had its own capacity constraints that the Army's production ramp revealed progressively as metal parts production increased. Producing more shell bodies than the propellant supply chain could pair with charges did not produce more complete rounds. It produced a different kind of bottleneck at a different point in the system. The Army's target had been 100,000 rounds per month by October 2025. As of March 2026, according to the Department of Defense Inspector General's report, the actual production rate was 36,000. The target had been missed by 64,000 rounds per month. The Inspector General noted that the lack of production increased the risk of not meeting the operational needs of the United States, allies, and partner nations in potential future conflicts. That language, risk of not meeting operational needs in potential future conflicts, is the specific formulation of a bureaucratic document acknowledging that the strategic problem the Ukraine war revealed has not been solved. The single production line has become several production lines. The gap between the new production capacity and the requirement of a peer-on-peer conflict has narrowed. It has not closed. The human dimension of this story sits not in a single named individual, but in the aggregate of what the arithmetic meant on the ground in eastern Ukraine. A Ukrainian artillery battalion without sufficient ammunition cannot fire at the rate its tactical situation requires. It cannot suppress the Russian artillery that is firing at it. It cannot interdict the logistics routes that resupply the Russian positions it is trying to reduce. The shortage of shells is not an abstraction. It is the silence in a fire support mission that should have fired. It is the Russian advance that was not stopped because the rounds to stop it were being consumed faster than the single production line in Scranton could replace them. But Senior Sergeant Oleksiy Mikhailenko served as an artillery crew commander with the Ukrainian Army's 44th Artillery Brigade in the Zaporizhzhia region through 2023. In a documented account published by the Associated Press in September 2023, he described the experience of ammunition rationing, receiving allocation notices that limited his crew's daily firing rate regardless of the tactical situation in front of them. He described watching Russian positions that could have been engaged, targets that the ranging data confirmed were within effective reach, that his crew could not fire on because the rounds were not there to fire. The allocation existed because the supply chain mathematics required it. The mathematics existed because of decisions made in Washington in the 1990s about what kind of war the future held. The artillery crew in Zaporizhzhia was the human address of the institutional calculation made at the Last Supper dinner in October 1993, 30 years earlier and thousands of miles away. The M795 has a cultural footprint that is essentially zero. It does not appear in action films. It does not have a nickname in popular culture. Artillery shells, unlike rifles and pistols, do not develop biographical identities. They are consumable items, manufactured in bulk, fired in hundreds from a single position in a single engagement, and forgotten individually even by the crews who fired them. The M795 is not a character, it is a quantity. And the story of that quantity, of what it means when the quantity is insufficient, is the story of how a 30-year strategic assumption met the arithmetic of a war it had not planned for, and of how the most powerful military alliance in history discovered, in real time, that the industrial capacity it had spent 3 decades dismantling could not be rebuilt in the years available before that arithmetic became strategically decisive. It started as a single production line, 15.3 acres near downtown Scranton. One facility, the entire American 155 millimeter production capacity concentrated in a plant built for a different era of warfare and never expanded because the procurement system that funded it had been optimized for the 60,000 rounds of Desert Storm rather than the 6,000 rounds per day of Ukraine. It survived 3 decades of budget cuts, BRAC closures, and industrial consolidation that reduced America's ammunition plant network from 92 facilities at the peak of World War II to 5 facilities operating today. Not because Scranton was irreplaceable, but because the political cost of closing it exceeded the institutional will to close it. And the result was that it became irreplaceable by default while everything around it was closed. It has transferred over 3 million rounds to Ukraine since February 2022 at a cost of $4.5 billion in production investment. It is being supplemented by new facilities in Iowa, Arkansas, and Kansas that did not exist before the war revealed they were needed. It is still producing 36,000 rounds per month against a target of 100,000 4 years into the largest ammunition production expansion the United States has undertaken since World War II. And the gap between 36,000 and 100,000 is not primarily a funding gap or a will gap. It is the physical, irreducible consequence of the fact that the industrial capacity dismantled across 3 decades cannot be rebuilt in 4 years, and that the workforce trained across 2 generations cannot be retrained in 2, and that the forging presses required to expand production have their own lead times that no supplemental appropriation can compress below the physical limits of the supply chains that build them. The M795 is not scarce because it is difficult to design or complicated to use. It is scarce because the institution responsible for producing it spent 30 years making procurement decisions calibrated to the last war it had fought. 60,000 shells, 100 hours, decisive victory, and discovered in 2022 that the next war looked nothing like it, and that the single production line it had left standing in Scranton, Pennsylvania was the arithmetic consequence of that 30-year assumption, meeting a conflict that consumed in 36 hours what the line produced in a month. The assumption was wrong. The line was real. And the distance between those 2 facts is still being measured in shells per month against a target that has not yet been reached. If you enjoyed this, hit like, subscribe, and check out the next video right here.